Franklin Dale was a ghost made of flesh and bone. At 51 years old, he had perfected the art of being invisible. He lived in a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city, a place where neighbors came and went without ever learning his name. The man at the corner store where he bought milk every Tuesday morning couldn't have picked him out of a police lineup. This was not by accident. It was a skill, honed over 15 years in a profession that demanded absolute anonymity. Frank was a cleaner. He didn't work with mops or buckets. He worked with industrial solvents, specialized lighting, and a forensic understanding of human biology. When a violent transaction concluded in bloodshed, Frank was the man who arrived to ensure the location was scrubbed from existence, leaving no trace for the police to find. His clients were not the kind of people you said no to, and the money was good enough to make sure you never wanted to. His life was governed by a simple, brutal code of rules. Never ask the client's name. Never look at the faces of the victims. Never question the job. He was a tool, a specialist, and tools did not have emotions. He was paid in cash, always left behind a sealed envelope with a location, and was expected to erase everything. A bullet hole in drywall was patched. Blood-soaked carpet was removed and replaced down to the subfloor. Biological matter was dissolved with chemicals that left no DNA. His work was methodical, lonely, and paid exceptionally well. It allowed him to live a quiet life, free from want, but also free from connection. He had no family he spoke to, no friends he trusted. In 15 years, he had never broken a single rule. He had never left a job unfinished. He had never been seen. Until the night of the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the rural roads into rivers of mud, and Frank felt a strange unease he couldn't explain as he drove toward the address on his latest job. The call came through a burner phone, as it always did. A secluded house on a rural road, an hour outside the city. The rain was a constant, drumming roar against his van as he drove. The address led him to a property surrounded by dense woods, invisible from the main road. The house itself was dark, but the garage door was open a crack, as instructed. He slipped inside, pulling on his disposable coveralls, booties, and a respirator mask. His equipment cases were silent as he moved through the mudroom and into the kitchen. The air was thick with the metallic, sweet scent of fresh blood. 2 bodies lay in the living room. He didn't pause to identify them, only to assess the spatter pattern and the volume of fluid. He calculated the work ahead in gallons and square feet. It was a standard job. He began his process, his movements efficient and detached. He worked for nearly an hour, methodically erasing every trace of violence, when a sound stopped him cold. A muffled thump, coming from beneath the floorboards. He was in the middle of treating a particularly stubborn stain on the hardwood when he heard it. A muffled sound, barely audible over the wind outside. He froze. The house was supposed to be empty. He had checked the bedrooms, the closets, the bathroom. All clear. He listened, his breathing slow and controlled behind the mask. Then he heard it again. A faint, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from beneath him. He located the basement door, tucked away in a corner of the kitchen. It was padlocked from the outside. The padlock was new, heavy-duty. A rule whispered in his mind, finish the job and leave. The client didn't pay him for curiosity. Another thump, more desperate this time. Frank stared at the padlock. For 15 years, he had been a ghost. But ghosts didn't have to listen to the sounds of the living. He reached into his toolkit and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. The metal snapped with a loud crack that seemed to echo through the entire house. He pulled the door open and stared down into darkness. The basement stairs were old and creaked under his weight. A single bare bulb lit the space, revealing a concrete floor, a furnace, and stacks of forgotten boxes. In the center of the room, tied to a heavy wooden chair, was a woman. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair plastered to her face with sweat. Duct tape was wound around her head, covering her mouth. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Frank's. She was shaking violently. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The cleaner and the evidence. The woman's eyes were not pleading for mercy from an attacker. They were pleading for help from a stranger. Frank saw the fear, yes, but also a spark of defiance. She was fighting to stay conscious, fighting to stay alive. This was not part of the job description. He had never seen a victim alive before. He had never had to look into the eyes of someone who could still speak, still feel, still hope. His hands, steady for 15 years, trembled slightly. He moved towards her, his footsteps echoing in the small space. He pulled the tape from her mouth in one quick, sharp motion. She gasped, sucking in air, but didn't scream. Her eyes were still locked on his, searching for any sign of his intent. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. Frank didn't answer. He knelt and examined the ropes binding her wrists and ankles. They were tight, cutting into her skin. He pulled a knife from his pocket, a razor-sharp tool he used for cutting carpet. The woman flinched, but held his gaze. He sliced through the ropes. She slumped forward, and he caught her by the shoulder, holding her steady. She was trembling uncontrollably. He helped her to her feet. She was weak, her legs barely supporting her. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice muffled by the respirator. She nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her face. He led her up the stairs, past the bodies he was paid to erase, and to the garage. His mind was racing. He was breaking every rule he had ever lived by. He opened the back of his van and pulled out a thick, dark blanket. "Get in. Stay down. Don't make a sound." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked back into the house, retrieved a thick envelope of cash from his personal bag, and returned to the van. He handed it to her. "There's $5,000 in here. Take it. Run. Don't go to the police. Don't tell anyone what you saw tonight. Not a single soul. Do you understand?" She stared at the envelope, then back at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why are you helping me?" Frank didn't have an answer. He didn't know himself. He just knew that he couldn't leave her there. "Don't ask questions. Just go. There's a bus station 20 miles east. Disappear." She took the envelope, her fingers brushing against his gloved hand. For a moment, she looked like she might say something else. Instead, she just nodded and stumbled out of the garage into the rain. Frank watched her go, then turned back to finish the job. 3 days passed. Frank tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. He had given her a chance. What happened next was her responsibility. He went back to his routine. He cleaned his apartment. He bought milk on Tuesday. He waited for the next burner phone call. But the image of her eyes wouldn't leave him. He found himself checking the news obsessively, looking for reports of a missing woman, a body found, anything. There was nothing. He started to relax. Maybe she had listened. Maybe she had disappeared like he told her to. Then the call came. It wasn't from his usual client. It was a different voice, colder, more direct. The job you did on Saturday night. There was a complication. Frank's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about, he said flatly. Don't play games. The girl. Where is she? Frank's mind raced. He had to think fast. There was no girl. Just the two. I cleared the house. There was a long pause on the other end. Someone is going to come talk to you. Be available. The line went dead. Frank knew he had made a fatal error. The woman he saved was not just a random victim. She was connected to the dead men. He had to find her before they did. His only clue was the hospital bracelet that had fallen from her ankle in the basement. He had picked it up without thinking, a habit from cleaning scenes. It had a name, Emma Lawson. And the name of a state psychiatric facility 50 miles away. He spent the next 2 days watching that facility from a distance. He saw staff come and go. He saw visitors. On the second day, he saw something that made his heart sink. 2 men in suits, clearly not doctors, walking into the administration building. They emerged an hour later with a folder. Frank knew that look. They were professionals, just like the people who hired him. He had to move fast. That night, he broke into the facility's records office. He found Emma's file. She had been admitted 6 months ago. The diagnosis was vague. The notes mentioned delusions, paranoia, a history of making accusations against powerful people. The file also contained something else, a visitor log. One name appeared repeatedly. A man named Richard Cross. The same Richard Cross who owned a construction company that had been investigated for money laundering twice, with both investigations quietly dropped. The same Richard Cross whose name was whispered in connection with half the organized crime in the region. Emma hadn't been paranoid. She had been silenced. Frank now understood the full scope of what he had stumbled into. Emma wasn't just a witness to a double homicide. She was the key to taking down a powerful man. And now both the criminals and the corrupt officials who protected them were hunting for her. He had to find her first. He started with the bus station. He showed her photo to clerks, ticket sellers, anyone who would look. Nothing. He checked homeless shelters, women's clinics, cheap motels. Nothing. Days passed. He knew he was running out of time. He found her on the 5th day, in a small town 200 miles away. She was living in a rundown motel, using a fake name, working cash under the table at a diner. When she opened the door and saw him, her face went pale. "You found me," she whispered. "They're coming," Frank said. "You need to move. Now." She didn't argue. She grabbed a small bag and followed him to his van. As they drove, she told him everything. Her father had been Richard Cross's accountant. He had discovered that Cross was laundering money through his legitimate businesses, using the construction company as a front. Before he could go to the police, he was killed in a car accident that wasn't an accident. Emma had the evidence. Bank records, encrypted files, voice recordings. She had hidden them before she was grabbed. The two men killed in the house were Cross's men, sent to retrieve the files. They had been killed by a rival faction, and Emma was left as a loose end. Frank realized that the only way to end this was to give the evidence to someone who could use it. But who could they trust? The local police were compromised. The state police might be, too. He thought about the FBI, but walking into a federal building with a fugitive and a story like this was a risk. They needed leverage. They needed to force Cross to expose himself. Frank had an idea. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only play. He knew how Cross operated. He knew the kind of men he hired. And he knew how to make a scene look like something it wasn't. For 15 years, he had erased evidence of crimes. Now he would create it. He would stage a scene so perfect, so damning, that Cross would have no choice but to react. And when he did, Frank would be waiting. Emma agreed. She had been silent too long. It was time to fight back. The trap was set in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Frank used every skill he had learned over 15 years. He placed evidence strategically. He created a scene that would look like a meeting gone wrong, with Cross's fingerprints everywhere. Then he sent an anonymous tip to a federal task force that had been investigating Cross for years. They waited in the shadows, Frank and Emma, watching as Cross arrived with his men, walked into the trap, and realized too late what was happening. The raid was swift. Cross was arrested. The evidence Emma had hidden for months was finally in the right hands. In the chaos, Frank and Emma slipped away. He drove her to the bus station one last time. This time, she had a new identity, a new life waiting. She thanked him, asked his real name. He just shook his head. "Doesn't matter," he said. As she disappeared into the crowd, Frank walked back to his van. He was no longer invisible. But for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was alive. He drove away, not knowing what came next, but knowing he would sleep a little easier that night.